But before we get into the particularities of the Constitution, let us first dial the clock back to the summer of 1787. It was in that year that the delegates convened in what we know today as Independence Hall, but what was called back then the Pennsylvania State House on Chestnut Street in the middle of Philadelphia. 11 years earlier, the Continental Congress had gathered to declare the secession of the 13 American colonies from the British Empire in an unlikely bid to become the first set of colonies to successfully secede from a mother country. And now, 11 years later, delegates from all of the states were coming together to try to salvage a country whose very existence was mired in doubt. Today, we have the benefit of hindsight. And so when we think about the past, we often make the mistake, without even realizing it, of assuming that historical figures had a sense of how their futures would play out. But it is important for us to keep in mind that historical figures were as impoverished in their ability to foresee their futures as we are to see our own. Just like us, they were constantly blindsided by current events. And in the summer of 1787, there was very good reason to believe that the American experiment would die in its infancy. At this time, the country was governed by the Articles of Confederation, and the Articles were failing. It provided for a Congress, but the Congress was largely impotent to get anything done. You needed unanimity among the states to pass legislation. And so one state could effectively exercise veto power over the entire country. In early 1780s, 12 of the states agreed to an impost duty to help keep the federal government afloat during difficult times, and tiny Rhode Island unilaterally sank the measure. We probably have some people watching at home in Rhode Island. I'm going to pick on you guys for just a minute. Rhode Island was also the only state that refused to send delegates to the Constitutional Convention. It was by far the last state to ratify the Constitution. Its critics back in the 18th century called it Rogues Island. As far as the Articles of Confederation go, there was also no executive branch to enforce laws. There was no national judiciary that could arbitrate disputes between different citizens. Americans, because of their experience with British colonial rule, had grown weary of a centralized authority that had the power to encroach on their liberty. But the pendulum had now swung too far in the other direction. They had made a government too weak to function. Shays' Rebellion in late 1786 and early 87 threw into high relief the shortcomings of the Articles of Confederation, a ragtag militia of impoverished farmers in western Pennsylvania, many of them veterans of the Revolutionary War, took up arms and agitated against the practice of imprisoning farmers who could not pay off their debts. A mercenary army helped quell that insurrection, but the federal government had proved incapable of maintaining the rule of law. And so Shays' Rebellion threw into high relief the failures of the Articles of Confederation and the need for a new system of government. George Washington, for one, was horrified by Shays' Rebellion and the specter of anarchy. There were credible fears that the country would degenerate into bloodshed and civil war writ large. Washington said at that time, "I am mortified beyond expression that in the moment of our acknowledged independence, we should, by our conduct, verify the predictions of our transatlantic foe and render ourselves ridiculous and contemptible in the eyes of all Europe." Now, I don't know if you could imagine today Americans seeming ridiculous and contemptible to Europeans, but try as you might. Washington agreed to preside at the Constitutional Convention, and his support was critical to lending legitimacy to the proceedings. No other American in his day or since has garnered such universal esteem from his countrymen. And so his singular prestige lent the Constitutional Convention the legitimacy that it needed. And so for this reason, we could think of Washington as symbolically the most important delegate. But in terms of the substance of the Constitution, the real father of the Constitution was, oh, there's Washington, was James Madison. And he's older in this image, but at the time, Madison was one of the youngest delegates at the convention. He was only 36 years old. And despite his youth, many of the more seasoned delegates deferred to his discretion in crafting the document because he was recognized as being the best read in Roman and Greek history. And those were the models for the American founders. Now, if you met James Madison, you wouldn't have necessarily thought at first blush that he would be a pivotal figure in American history. He was very diminutive and slight in stature. He was often sickly. He had a shy, retiring disposition. And so people were often surprised when they met his wife, Dolly, because she was this vivacious, gregarious, outgoing, sharp-witted, beautiful woman. And Dolly understood that James was possessed of an unusually precocious intellect. He had graduated Princeton in just 2 years, and he managed to win election to the Virginia state legislature when he was only in his mid-20s, although he failed to win re-election because he refused to resort to a common campaign tactic of plying voters with free whiskey, and this at a time when the average American drank 3 gallons of whiskey a year. Among the other delegates was Ben Franklin, the great Renaissance man of early America, the pioneer in publishing, in science, in diplomacy. The list goes on and on. Franklin had also served as the chairman of Pennsylvania's state constitutional convention in 1776. We also have, here we go, whoops, Alexander Hamilton, who really, until a few years ago, was arguably the least well understood of the founders. Thanks to the musical, many of you are probably of some familiarity with his unusual profile. He grew up in the Caribbean on British and Danish islands. He comes to America as a 17-year-old. He enrolls at was used to be called King's College, but today is known as Columbia. And while he's an undergraduate and fighting breaks out between the Patriots and the British, Hamilton joins the fray. His talents are recognized by George Washington. He joins Washington's military staff, and Hamilton continues to ride Washington's coattails later in his career. And so now that we have some sense of the history of the convention, of the perilous circumstances under which they met, that this was an 11th hour last-ditch attempt in Philadelphia in 1787 to save the fledgling republic. Now that we have some sense of the key figures, let's talk first about some general misconceptions about the Constitution that understanding its history can help debunk. And then, towards the second half of the talk, I want to get into some of the specific clauses of the Constitution that continued to be clouded by myths and misunderstandings. So, one of the most common myths concerning the Constitution is that we are supposed to have 3 co-equal branches of government. This is a line we hear a lot in our political and constitutional discourse. But in reality, the framers never intended for the 3 branches of government to be co-equal. They were explicit that they wanted them to be unequal. Let's see what the framers had to say in the Federalist Papers about this. I'll say just a word about the Federalist Papers in case it's been more than a year or two since your last U.S. history class. So it's important to keep in mind that at the end of the summer of 1787, the Constitution, when the convention closed, was merely ink on parchment. Only if enough states, 9 of the 13, ratified the Constitution would it take legal effect. And so John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison team up to author the Federalist Papers, a series of 85 essays, most of which were written during a frantic period in late 1787 and early 1788, in a bid to try to persuade New Yorkers specifically, although they were printed elsewhere, to ratify the Constitution. And these 3 authors worked largely independently, but they shared a single pseudonym, Publius, which was the name of a Roman statesman who had helped overthrow a monarchy and establish a republic. And so in the Federalist Papers, in Federalist, Well, let's go one at a time here. In Federalist 51, which is one of the most famous Federalist Papers, James Madison says, in Republican government, the legislative authority necessarily predominates. And Hamilton, in Federalist 78, says the judiciary is beyond comparison the weakest of the three departments of power. So we have this hierarchy where Congress should be the most powerful, and then the president, and then the judiciary. Why would the framers want to make Congress the most powerful? Why is the first article of the Constitution dedicated to Congress? Why is the longest article of the Constitution dedicated to Congress? Well, under British colonial rule, the local colonial legislatures were selected by the American people, but the governors of the colonies and the judges were selected by the crown. And so Americans had been primed by 150 years of colonial rule to see legislatures as uniquely representative of their needs. And one of the most remarkable developments in American history over the last 200 years is the expansion of executive power far beyond what the framers had initially envisioned, for better or worse.